Hi, my name is SUNGMIN,
And I'm Kevin YUEN.
and we're reporting live on the thaw between US and Cuba. The thaw between US and Cuba is becoming less hostile. The relation issue is slowly moving up the country's priority list.
Recently, Obama lifted the embargo on Cuba.
This allows the US to release tension with Cuba and make trade agreements on imports.
Obama was not able to lift the embargo without the permission of Congress.
Many Republicans argue that the thawed relationship between US and Cuba won't lead to more acceptance or democracy on the island.
The relationship between US and Cuba has had an unstable history.
We have had many rough patches with Cuba in the past, and today, rough patches have begun since the Cold War.
In 1961, President JFK increased tension between the US and Cuba when he planned the Bay of Pigs invasion. The US was not very accepting of the former government Castro was ruling his country with.
JFK planned to capture Cuban exiles and commanded them to overthrow Fidel Castro. Now let's report to Faran and Antoni for a brief history on the relationship between US and Cuba.
Thanks, Kevin and SUNGMIN. In 1961, the United States sent trained Cuban exiles to Cuba to try and overthrow Fidel Castro's government. This was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. They failed miserably. The invasion is considered part of the Cold War because the US was trying to prevent communism from taking hold in the Americas. The invasion occurred on April 17, 1961. It did not go well. The Cuban Air Force was damaged by early airstrikes, and there were still planes left to attack the invaders. Once the invasion started, it took too long for the troops and ammunition to get off their ships. The results were disastrous for the United States. The government looked weak, and the CIA looked even weaker. It also seemed to strengthen Castro's government within Cuba and caused him to look to the Soviet Union as a military ally. Shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1962 when the Soviet Union began to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. The United States refused to allow this, and after 13 tense days and many secret negotiations, the Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba captured pictures of Soviet missiles in Cuba. These missiles could reach any point of the United States with nuclear warheads causing mass destruction. Eventually, the two sides reached an agreement. The Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba as long as the United States agreed to never invade Cuba again. In secret, the US also had to agree to remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. The crisis was over. Those are the major points in history that started the feud between US and Cuba. Now back to you, Kevin and SUNGMIN.
Thanks, Faran. In 1980, the US began taking escaped Cubans into our country and giving them citizenship. The US strengthened its embargo rules in 1992 and again in 1996 with the Helms-Burton Act.
In 2012, Cuba lifted visa restrictions. Raul Castro's government removes bureaucratic requirements for Cubans to obtain government permission to travel abroad. Eliminating the full embargo required a vote from Congress, though some members from both sides of the aisle have expressed support for repeal. Many Republicans argue the thawed relations won't lead to more openness or democracy on the island. Congressional critics of Obama's deal to end U.S. isolation of Cuba are threatening to frustrate key elements of his plan by withholding funding for a new embassy and blocking the appointments of a new American ambassador in Havana. Attempts to roll back the president's deal with Cuba have reiterated its appeal for Congress to overturn a 1996 act that strengthened the trade embargo. President Obama told Congress he intends to remove Cuba a U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism, clearing the main obstacle to restoring diplomatic relations and reopening embassies shut down for more than half a century. Now let's go to Andrew to see what actions Obama is taking on the U.S. and Cuba thaw.
Kevin and SUNGMIN. Obama wants to authorize expanded sales and exports of certain goods and services from the U.S. to Cuba. He also wants to authorize American citizens to import additional goods from Cuba. Lastly, he wants to initiate new efforts to increase Cubans' access to communications and their ability to communicate freely. Chief diplomat, Obama has the power to make treaties, appoint ambassadors, and form relationships with other countries. He cannot perform most of these actions without the consent of the Senate. That's all. Back to you, Kevin and Sungmin.
Okay, this is all we have time for today.
See you next week.
Bye.